Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Arizona League of Cities and Towns virtual conference. This is the fourth day of our conference and the last day. Today we have our Pundits panel going for you. This is one of our staples at our conference every year, and particularly in election years, we like to discuss what will be expected on the ballot and what those outcomes might be and how what is on the ballot might be driving voter turnout. So with us, we have an esteemed group of colleagues here. First, we have Chuck Coughlin, who's the CEO and president of High Ground Public Affairs, which he started 25 years ago. For those of you that have been around the Capitol, you all know Chuck. For those of you that aren't, Chuck served as Governor Brewer's transition chairman for 2009 transition. He was a campaign manager and then subsequently the deputy chief of staff for Governor Fife Symington. He also worked for Arizona Attorney General Grant Woods and U.S. Senator John McCain. In addition to Chuck, we have Chad Campbell, who is Arizona's Senior Vice President for Strategies 360. Prior to his work there, Chad served in the Arizona legislature from 2007 through 2014, the last 4 years of which he served as the House Minority Leader. Chad was often seen in his time at the legislature as one who could reach across the aisle and work with the opposing party. In that, he worked on tax reforms as well as Medicaid expansion. Finally, we have Paul Bentz, who is the Senior Vice President of Research and Strategy at High Ground Public Affairs. He is the back-to-back winner of the best pollster for the Arizona Capital Times and has nearly 2 decades of experience in strategy, messaging, and campaign management. So we're very happy to have the three of them, and thank you guys for joining us again this year. They were part of the group last year, and we thought it went so well we wanted to have each of them back. There's so much on the ballot this year to discuss, so we had to be selective in the items that we wanted to address in this 90-minute session. We do have a hard stop at the end of 90 minutes. I can't promise that we'll have time for question and answer. If we do, we will certainly take them. There's a question and answer button or a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to type your questions in there as they come along. But again, we're going to effort to get through all of this within that 90-minute time frame and not certain if we'll have time for Q&A. We want to cover the following topics: voter turnout, the presidential race, the United States Senate race, 2 major initiatives that are on our ballot this cycle: Invest in Education and Smart and Safe, as well as what's going to happen at the state legislature. So without further ado, I want to kick it off and turn it over to Paul, and obviously Chuck and Chad, feel free to interject. But Paul, after the August primary, you put out a blog post on the High Ground website about turnout in Arizona and how we set records over the last couple of election cycles. So can you elaborate on that, and then I'll help you scroll through the slides as you go.
Sure. Good morning, and thanks for having me this morning. And hello out there in internet land. This is definitely not quite as fun as seeing all you crowded folks in the auditorium together, wandering in and out after a late evening. So, but I appreciate the opportunity, and thanks to the league for having me. And yeah, we did just see record turnout in the 2020 primary. And as you can see, turnout overall was about 36%, a little more than that, which is huge for Arizona. It's been pretty consistently about 30% for the last 20 years or so. But one thing to note about that is while we do talk about record turnout, that does mean that 2/3 of the electorate did not vote in August. But what it does bode for us is that we do anticipate that it will be a high voter turnout in the November election as well. And this was the first time we got over 1.4 million folks to participate in this election. You can see an uptick in the last 2 cycles. It went from about 29% to 33% in 18, and then rose again in 2020 as well. And you can go ahead and go to that next one there. You can see it's been fairly standard, but it has trended upwards. That is definitely the Trump effect. You can see that first bump in 2010 was the Obama effect. We used to be just in the 20s for a long time and then bumped up to the 30% range, and now we're in that 36% range. And so what's behind that is what I like to be calling the surge, because the blue wave is so 2018. So I'm going to spend most of my time talking about this as in the form of a surge. And what this really means is that traditionally in Arizona, we saw about a pretty significant Republican advantage when it comes to voting in the primary. It's been sort of our little secret, and we could tell who was going to show up based on, we knew it was mostly Republicans. And you can see it really started in 2010, where Republican ballots were about 64%, and it's been pretty consistently about 60% since that time. But what we actually saw is that Democrat participation from 16 to 18 rose 40%, and then it went up another 32% from 18 to 20. I mean, so that is a massive spike in turnout, and suddenly the Republican advantage narrowed from about 60% to down to 52, which you can see is pretty stark when you look at the next chart there. The surge in action is real. Those two numbers are coming together. I don't think this is the year that Democrats start out participating Republicans when it comes to the November election, but I think we're going to be much closer than we have ever seen before. So what we actually look at, though, is it's important to note that turnout was up across the board. This was not just that Democrats turned out. Republicans turnout was up about 7 points on that next slide, Nick. If you look, basically, Republicans increased by 7%, but the issue is that Democrats overall increased by 30%, and independents were up about 23%. And so basically what you see is, we've said this for a long time, is that Republicans show up for these elections, and it really comes down to who shows up around them. And this is the real first case where we actually saw that, this is of registered voters here. So we went from, in 2016, only about 24% of registered Democrats participated in the primary. That's up to 29%, and it was a whopping 38% in this August 2020 primary. The other thing that we're looking at is that if you're an independent or unaffiliated voter, you have to request a type of ballot to vote in the primary. We allow independents to vote in our primary election, but it is a slightly unfair process because they actually have to take a two-step approach. They've got to tell what kind of ballot they want, and then they get sent it. So what we actually saw is, for the first time in recent history, we actually saw independent primary requests, at least in Maricopa County, which is what I have the data for so far, trended towards Democrats. It was as high as 51% leaning towards Democrats. It ended about 49.6 compared to 43% basically for Republicans, and 7% nonpartisan. So what does that mean for 2020? When we're looking ahead to 2020, you can see there's a pretty significant difference in the turnout when you look at between a presidential election and a midterm election. But what 2018, it bucked the trend. It had the second highest midterm turnout in Arizona history with about 65%. The highest in state history was 1982. And before that, you can see we've been pretty standard in the mid 70% range for our 2020 or for our presidential elections, with the high watermark being 2008 in the Obama election, which was 77.7. We tend to believe that's going to be our floor for this election. The 77% is what we anticipate is sort of generally who's going to show up. But when you look at the uptick in enthusiasm that we've seen, not only in the midterm, but also in the 2019 off-cycle elections, you look at the higher voter turnout than usual in the Phoenix mayor's race and in a lot of the school bond and override elections, we think this bodes for a much higher than usual voter turnout. We've pegged it at about 79%. Arizona's historical high is 80.1 in 1980. I think we could get there, but we're not predicting that just yet. But one thing we do see is on the next slide, I think we anticipate if we had 79% turnout, that would be about 3.1 million voters. So that'd be Arizona's first time in history exceeding 3 million voters. That'd be about 500,000 more voters than we saw 4 years ago. And what that really means for us and what we're seeing right now is we think the Republican advantage will be lower than usual. In a midterm election, the Republican advantage had been as high as about 12 points. In the 2018, it fell to 7. what we usually see in the presidential election is that the Republican average was somewhere between 8 to 10 point advantage in previous elections. So we've been pegging it at about 6, and we're thinking it's probably going to be closer to 3. And part of that is, if you go to the next slide, what we're looking at here is we're seeing a significant net gain in the voter registration, and Republicans and Democrats were neck and neck basically through about the beginning of this year. But since the last election, Democrats have actually registered 141,000 new voters compared to 100,000 to Republicans. So that's a 40,000 vote gain, or 11% increase. Independents are the slowest among the groups, which is also interesting to note because it used to be basically divided evenly into thirds. We had about a third Republican, about a third Democrat, and a third, as the Secretary of State defines as other. But one thing that we do note is that across the counties, Maricopa's up 7, Pima's up 5, but Greater Arizona, or rural Arizona, as some folks call it, is up 7% as well. That is due to a very active, very concentrated effort by Trump and others to get those voters registered and activated to participate in the general election. So we do think across the board, we're going to see higher voter turnout, not just in the metro areas, but in rural Arizona as well. And then you look at Maricopa County in particular. Maricopa County is going to make up 60-something% or more of the election. So that's why if you're sick of the commercials already, I have bad news for you. You're going to see even more, because this election is going to be won and lost in Maricopa County. Greater Arizona will be about a quarter of all voters. And I think they're going to try even harder to raise that number and make it even more competitive this time around. But you can see Maricopa County is going to be the biggest concentration of voters. And if you look, the demographics of Maricopa County are shifting. This is a great slide that I wish I knew how to do, but I am not technically able to do these fun maps. But you can see there's a few different map people on Twitter to follow. If you want to follow them, I do. I'm a nerd, so you. But this one is CMRU. They put together this shifting demographic of Maricopa County, and you can see on the left there, that's the Romney-Obama from 2012. And then you can see Sinema versus Mcsally from last year. And the big difference you'll see is that the some of the areas that were red or light blue last time are now going darker. It basically follows the Loop 101, the high-tech, high-wage corridor, and is growing. Chuck, you made an observation about this. I don't know if you want to share with
Well, depending on your political perspective, you would look at this as a cancer growing inside of the county, or perhaps it would be pollen in the middle of a rose, depending on your perspective. Yes.
But I mean, the demographics of Maricopa County are definitely shifting. You can see, especially if you look at the southeast valley there, in those Gilbert and Chandler areas where they were purple and red in 2012, they're much more blue and went to Sinema in 2018. Now, it's important to note that Sinema is a very unique candidate that did a very good job appealing to that electorate out there. You can also see in the Northeast Valley that demographic is changing as well.
Well, so, how much, just a quick question, how much of this is attributable to in-migration versus partisan swings, or people switching from, let's say, a PND or an independent to something else?
It's a combination. That's a great question. It's a combination of both. I do think we see, as we attract higher wage earners, as we bring more corporate headquarters here, and it's not just California. That's what everybody says, California, my Arizona, and whatever. It's not just that, though, but those, the people who are coming in for those jobs tend to, be more viable and tend to be swing voters. They tend to be more likely to register as independent, tend to care more about those issues. The other thing we're actually seeing, Nick, is the hinterlands, the rural areas, sort of the more suburbs, are getting redder. We also see one of the things that isn't reflected in this map is the reddening of both Pinal County. Pinal County is significantly more conservative and more Republican than it has been in the past. And the same thing can be said about Yavapai County. So even though our metro area is saying going more blue or purple, as it were, the sort of rural areas adjacent to the metros are definitely going redder. So what does that mean? And I'm almost done, I promise. What does that mean for 2020? As I said, basically the traditional gubernatorial advantage for Republicans had been about 12 points. In 2018, with the blue wave, it fell to about 7. Presidentially, in previous elections, it's somewhere in that 7 to 9 point range if you look at past participation. We think with that surge that we just saw and the efforts that are underway to turn out more voters and likely voters and other folks, we think that it's close. We think somewhere around a 3-point Republican advantage. So I'm not ready to say that Democrats are going to outperform Republicans in this election, but it's going to be a lot closer and much more narrow than we've ever seen in recent history. So that's kind of what we're looking at. 3 million voters, high voter turnout, a much narrow gap than we've seen in the past.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. That was really good information. So now we're going to focus on the presidential race. I think, Paul, you clearly indicated that from high ground's view, Trump at the top of the ticket not only drove 2016 outcomes, but also the off-cycle gubernatorial 2018 turnout, even though he wasn't on the ballot. So most polls, both national and statewide, had Biden leading Trump prior to both parties' conventions. I think it took a while for the convention polling, post-convention polling to come out. Conventional wisdom was that Trump would get a bounce out of that because I think a lot of those betting markets, whether or not you pay attention to them, were moving in Trump's favor. So a number of polls came out yesterday, and I'll just sort of turn it over to Chuck, Chad, and Paul. Any one of you jump in first, but what are your feelings about the polling, and particularly here in Arizona between Trump and Biden? I think 538 has the polling average as Biden up by about 4.7 here. So how do you guys view that, and what's driving that?
Chad, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Chuck. And hi, everybody. Thanks for letting us participate again this year. I think when you look at I'll start that polling, Nick. When you look at some of the post-convention polling this year, the conventions weren't conventional, obviously, right? Nothing is nowadays. So I would take those with a grain of salt. I don't think that post-convention polling has as much of relevance as it has in the past. I think the conventions were just so different this year, and voters perceive them differently, that I'm not sure the polling itself post-convention is all that important, but I think the polling overall is important. And I think that it's shown consistently that Biden has a slight edge here in Arizona, some within the margin of error, some just outside of that margin of error. But they show, for the most part, that Biden does have an edge. And going back to Paul's slide presentation a minute ago, there's a reason why that's happening. If you look at that voter gap, the GOP gap this year, to Paul's point, if it's down to 3%, which I think he's spot on in that assessment, I think. If you look at that small gap, plus the independents trending towards Democratic candidates right now, that is the trend right now for the most part, it all adds up to a Biden win. And really, if you look at the map that Paul showed with the Sinema voters in 2018, here in Maricopa County, and if you look at across the state, there's some trends there. That Sinema type of voter is going to vote for Biden most likely, and that's going to be that pathway to victory. So I do think Biden's going to win Arizona. I think it's going to be very small, very, very close, razor thin, but I do think Biden's going to pull Arizona through this time.
So it is 2020, which everybody is the year from hell so far. And we know that by the last several months, we don't know. I mean, we know what we don't know. I mean, that it will be unusual in this cycle. And there will be something that happens in these last, I think it's under 60 days now before Election Day. And of course, most states, and as Arizona does, starts voting in the first week of October. So the news cycles get shrunk here. I was reading the paper this morning about the vaccine coming out in the first week of November. The Big Ten is going to go back and play football. Hopefully, Nick and I are both rooting for that, which will help, Trump in those key Midwestern states. But really, all we know is about Arizona, right? And what the national folks are learning about Arizona. It used to be that we were not understood as a state at all. And what Paul showed us is that the state's changing. Remember in 2018, I think the Democrats picked up 4 seats in the House. In 2018, the Democrats picked up 4 seats on the statewide ballot for the first time in a decade. And so we have to acknowledge, and I think what Paul showed there is a trend line going on. One of the things that we have to all look at in a presidential or any statewide race, which the presidential is out here, is what's the path to victory? What is the path to victory? For Biden, it would be running up the number in Maricopa County and expanding that purple map that Paul showed, growing that in the suburbs around Maricopa County, that 101 corridor Paul spoke about. And for Trump, it's minimizing that in Maricopa County while driving up that greater Arizona vote. I mean, I was in Pine Top last weekend. I mean, it is Trump country. I think we know that. I got my Douglas coffee mug here. Now that might not be Trump country down there, but we know that rural greater Arizona provides Trump a cushion, whether that's 3-1. Paul scoffs at my analysis when I say 4-1, because that would be a real beating if he gets beat 4-1 in rural Arizona. If Biden gets beat 4-1, but that kind of margin ameliorates a loss in Maricopa County. I think we all know that there's only been one candidate that's lost Maricopa County on a statewide ballot and won. That was the state superintendent of public instruction in 6 years ago. So that there's a path here, but they both have a tactical game in mind of how they speak to their voters and what they need to do. We saw news recently that Biden was going to be visiting Arizona. We can count on the president and the vice president coming out, and maybe we'll see them both in greater Arizona. We might see them in Yavapai County. We might see them in the White Mountains. I mean, you might see something like that tactically to draw, because Trump's biggest tactical advantage that's been taken away from him is the rally, because he used that rally to broadcast his popularity to people who don't otherwise get into big urban cores. Well, that's been taken away from him because of the virus. And so how do you replicate that? How do you do that? And it's really only on the ground that you can do that and then repeat it and get it covered nationally. So I'd agree with everybody else in this. And well, what Chad was saying is, if you're calling it today, you'd say that Biden has a narrow marginal lead because of his advantage in Maricopa County, and it's narrowed because of Trump's overwhelming popularity in greater Arizona.
So I think the one thing to watch is turnout. If we see a large amount of votes early, if the trend is higher than usual early, that bodes well for Biden in the fact that Trump's campaign, at least so far, has not been focused on getting people to vote for him. It's more about not voting for Biden or scaring people away for Biden. That's a suppressive move, that's a move to keep people away and try to have them skip that race or not vote for Biden. So unless the Trump campaign transitions to giving more reasons to vote for him, I think if we see higher voter turnout, that bodes well for Biden.
So I think what Paul just said there, Chuck, I've heard you say this probably 100 times and Paul probably more than 1,000, but you always tell politicians to stay on their yoga mat. What is Trump's yoga mat in this particular scenario then?
Well, that's been the struggle, as Paul accurately pointed out. It's been to promote fear and as Paul pointed out, that is a suppressive voter message, not a drive message. So if he can transition, as he is attempting to do on the virus, I mean, I said to somebody the other day, the lowest hanging fruit for Arizona would be to pass DACA, or pass some type of immigration reform, continue to do the type of efforts that they've done to re-stimulate the economy, go back and figure out what those messages are that can promote economic growth at this point in time, but find a narrative. I think, I'm not wishing for this, but an international conflict. We saw the Russian MiG fly next to the B-52 a couple weeks, like a week ago. Any type of wag the dog moment would benefit Trump at this moment in time. I'm certainly not wishing for that, but those types of things that focus authority on the White House and conflict and international conflict seem to have been his bread and butter play throughout the 4 years of his presidency.
It sounds like, based on what the three of you said, that it'll be very close, and that lends to not finding out what happened in Arizona on the night of the 3rd, but waiting for some of those mail-in ballots to be counted and the tallies to come in.
Oh, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of drop-offs that we are going to have to wait for. So yeah, you can count on that. The one thing I wanted to add is I watched most of the GOP convention speeches. You're welcome. You didn't have to. I did it for you. And it was painful, I will tell you that. But the funniest thing about it is they have the message that works about the economy, of the things that they did well. I mean, when you rattle off the accomplishments, whether or not he's really responsible for them is a debate for another time. But when they rattle off the accomplishments, they actually did pretty well. But time after time, the thing that happened is they would go off the rails for the second half of the speech. Donald Jr. did it. Eric Trump did it. Pence did it. Everybody, it's like they had two speech writers, which I bet they did probably. Someone wrote a nice speech and then Trump added stuff to the end of it, because they start with the stuff that they ought to be talking about and then always ended with all this negativity and danger and peril. And if they could stick to the first half of the message, they'd be better off than what they typically do.
Awesome. Well, thank you. That's a good insight. 2 months out on what's going to happen, on November 3rd. But I think, as with everything, there will be a lot of swings, at least in this particular race. One race that hasn't swung very much, regardless of what ads have been on the television, is the second biggest race here that we have in Arizona, the U.S. Senate race between Martha Mcsally and Mark Kelly. Obviously, polling up to this point has shown that Mcsally has a substantial ground to make up in order to fill that seat vacated by Senator John McCain. So, Chuck, there's big money coming into this race. I think that was reported 2 days ago that the majority leader's PAC is going to be spending $10 million or more here in Arizona. What should we expect that messaging to be? Is it going to be more about China, or is there going to be something new?
Well, back to the Senate race, back to the presidential race. What the Mcsally campaign needs is a positive narrative, because what we've seen is, as you just pointed out, Nick, is a pretty pummeling narrative on Kelly, and Kelly in turn responding in kind with a pretty pummeling narrative on Mcsally. As we've pointed out here, what that does is suppress. It doesn't motivate parts of the electorate to come out for you. And so she's got to find, I expect she's behind right now. Voters felt like they got to know her in the 18 cycle, which wasn't great for her. She came into Maricopa County. She was a Southern Arizona congresswoman who had a record of bipartisanship, a record of voting across, with the other party in solving problems. And, when she showed up in that 18th cycle, she's got the military combat suit on and the narrative changed. And that's not in small part to the national narrative that Donald Trump has created. It's hard for Republican candidates to define themselves outside of that, outside of the shadow of Trump. We've seen examples of that in Arizona with our former Senator Flake, who attempted that and ended his career. So people have done very tentative things to do that. She's got time to be able to articulate where she separates herself. We know that immigration is a significantly important issue in Arizona. Mexico is our largest trading partner. We know those are things that if she wanted to do some things there and she had presidential consent, that there may be a path to do some things there. She could talk about that as well. But let's not minimize who she's running against here. As Paul said, and I think Chad agrees, now Senator Sinema ran a nearly pitch perfect campaign in the last cycle. She didn't call herself a Democrat. She didn't call herself an independent. She called herself an Arizonan. I mean, that has been Kelly's pitch now. She created a path, a narrative, her yoga mat, back to what we say here at High Ground, that she stuck to, and that she was excellent at executing. We've now seen a repetitive performance with that, with a candidate in Mark Kelly, who arguably is the finest Senate Democratic candidate in the country, who, I grew up with the right stuff, right? And watching men walk on the moon and, the hero status that comes with that. Mark has a brother that has served in space longer than anybody else, a twin brother. He's stuck by Gabby. Arguably, I've said this a number of times, had Gabby not experienced that tragic day, she would have been a U.S. Senator at some point in Arizona. So there is that feeling, at least I think within the electorate, particularly in Southern Arizona, and the empathy factor that begets to Mark, and the fact that he's been a super husband to her too, stuck by her, helped her through her recovery, and where she is today can not be questioned that it can't be part of Mark Kelly's legacy. So while Martha has struggled to establish that narrative, Mark came to the race with a great narrative, and I think has raised money at a presidential level. So it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard for Martha to recover in this cycle. I'm not saying it's impossible. As we said, it's 2020, folks. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm sure I'll get all kinds of love letters as a result of things that we say here today and other places. But she needs to establish a narrative that is a bit independent of the president, and she needs to establish that with Republican women in that blue map that Paul pointed out later, in those suburbs, in the 101 corridor around here, particularly Republican women and independents, party not designated voters, and try and be affiliate with them or create some passion for them. There are issues there that she can do that on, and we will see over the next 55 days or so if that's a possibility.
Chad, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, to add to that, I think that Senator Mcsally is really kind of taking the same route she took in 18, and Chuck alluded to this. In terms of her approach to this campaign has been pretty much negativity towards her opponent. Her and other independent expenditures out there try to, plant the seed in voters' minds that you can question Mark Kelly's motives, his patriotism, even his reasons for running. And to Chuck's point, that's not going to work with Mark Kelly. I just don't see how that works. Mark Kelly's an astronaut. He's a veteran. He's been with Gabby through thick and thin. So that narrative just isn't going to resonate with voters. And Mcsally tried this with Senator Sinema in 2018. She basically called her a traitor in a debate on television. She really went down that full negative rabbit hole against Sinema in 2018, and she's done the exact same thing against Kelly. And I just don't believe voters are going to look at Mark Kelly and believe that the attacks on him and trying to claim he's not a patriot and doesn't have allegiance to this country, it's just not going to work. It will work with her base, but her base is already there. And that's been the problem for Mcsally since day one, since she decided to run for the Senate. Chuck pointed out she was a bipartisan member of the House. And the minute she started running for the Senate, she became a very, very entrenched, very, very kind of far right, candidate who embraced Trump, and she hasn't looked back. So her messaging, for the most part, since the 18 election through this election so far, has been aimed solely at the base. She's not doing anything to reach out to those independent female voters, those swing voters that voted for people like Sinema and some of the other statewide in 2018. And the numbers show it. I mean, we got some polling on her numbers, and she's not popular with independent female voters, especially those suburban female voters that are moving away from Trump and kind of the policies and approach that Trump is taking. So, to Chuck's point, it's impossible to make any type of rock solid predictions in the 2020 environment when there's murder hornets one day. I saw a story the other day about a guy in a jetpack flying around LAX, and I was like, oh, that's 2020 again. So it's impossible to predict anything. But, I think if there's any race that we predict in Arizona right now, this is the safest one to predict. And I don't think that Mcsally is going to be able to make up this ground. I don't see her having enough time to pivot to some of that messaging that Chuck said she really needs to focus on, which I agree with. I think it's going to be too little too late, even if she does pivot to that messaging. But I'm not sure she's capable of doing it. I'm not sure the IEs are capable of doing it that support her. And I just don't think undermining the credibility of an astronaut, of really what, kind of the American hero embodies in Mark Kelly is going to work with the vast majority of voters. So I think it's probably going to be too little too late for Mcsally.
So one of the things, sorry, Paul, real quick. One of the things that obviously there's been a lot of focus on China by the Mcsally campaign. One of the things that I've started to read in the news is some criticism of Kelly for maybe not taking positions on certain items. Do you think that resonates going forward? Is that a strong enough message for Mcsally?
Paul, you want to go?
Yawn. I mean, yawn. First of all, I don't believe that Mcsally's down by 17 points. That latest poll that I saw, it's not, but she is down. And until we see a poll where they're neck and neck or even close, the issue is always that attacking Kelly might bring his number down some, but it's not commensurately bringing her number up. That's the challenge she has. She's not established a narrative that makes her likable. If they want to talk about Mark Kelly not taking a position on issues, it reminds me of when they were mad at Sinema for not being passionate during the debate, where she sort of didn't give full answers and just kind of sat there and gave a very measured tone. I don't think that's enough to move the needle against Kelly. That's the challenge that I think we have here. And in looking at the screen, before we hopped on this call, Nick pointed out that you guys maybe were these three gentlemen of the similar hairstyle. We're going to be doing a Three Stooges audition, but actually I think you guys are doing the seeing with the screen up here, I think you're doing the Mark Kelly impersonator competition, actually. So
let me say something before we leave this slide. I think it's important from a historical perspective, because this is John McCain's seat. This is what we're talking about, and the brand of republicanism that exists today is not John McCain's brand of republicanism. And if Mark Kelly does win, it will be the first time since 1952 that we have two Democratic senators in Arizona. And the interesting part about that is that that was the year Barry Goldwater beat Carl Hayden. And that was the beginning of another Republican era, of course, with Barry Goldwater. And this seems to be, in a way, if it does go the way Chad thinks, it's really the ending of an era of that type of republicanism and a voice calling out from the wilderness for a redefinition of what it means to be a Republican. We see some elements of the Daniel McCarthy group right now trying to start a third party of real hardcore, even more extreme conservatism. I can tell you that's not the way the state's going to go. And it will be up to, if this does happen this way, it will be up to people to redefine what it is to be a Republican in Arizona, because that's been our role. That's been our role as a state. We say around here, we were the 48th state in for a reason. Well, we're pretty much uninhabitable from large populations until we built the water resources here, which is a federal relationship to bring water to the valley. We built the military bases up to World War II. Then we built the CAP, and we built infrastructure so people could live here. And we have a border relationship with Mexico. All of those things are reliant on a healthy relationship with the federal government, which pretty much the voice of the Republican Party has been no now. And you'd add healthcare to that now too. And so it's a requirement of the future here, if this does go the way it is, that we re-narrate to some degree a successful narrative of what it means to be a Republican in Arizona.
Well said. Thank you guys for your comments on that. The next items on the ballot statewide are two initiatives. that have been at least efforted in the past. And the first one, Invest in Education, it was attempted to get on the ballot in 2018, but was ultimately thrown off the ballot because of some language in their voter or in their initiative pamphlet. So it was also initially thrown off the ballot this time around, albeit the state Supreme Court came back unanimously, put it back on the ballot. I've seen some initial ads from the Prop 208 campaign. I've also seen some initial polling. It seems as if, and correct me if I'm wrong, Chad or Paul or Chuck, that this is an uphill battle for the business community. Education remains one of the top concerns of Arizonans across the board. And it seems to be a very much an uphill battle to try and defeat this proposition.
Yeah, you want me to start?
Go ahead, Chad.
Yeah, in full disclosure, I'm working on both of these campaigns, so everybody knows that. I want to make sure I disclose that. So to start the Invest in Ed campaign, Nick, to your point, education funding is one of the top priorities year in, year out for the majority of Arizona voters. And we've gone far too long in this state without actually adequately addressing it. When you look at where we're at in education funding, we haven't even got back up to pre-2008 recession levels when you talk about inflation and other factors over the past decade or so. So I think the voters are really looking for a solution and looking for some new funding for their public schools. The polling that we've had since day one, when this campaign started to form, shows it's popular with the voters. We've had polling that started early on. We've had polling going through the pandemic as the environment's changed, and it's still popular with the voters. By no means is there any type of thing called a slam dunk when you're talking about taxation in any state, let alone in Arizona. But this plan, this proposal, for the most part, in the research we've done, does seem to be popular. And I think to your point, Nick, the business community, it does have challenges in opposing this. And we've seen it already in some of their messaging, some of the claims they make, which we would argue are a little outlandish, and don't actually reflect the true nature of how this new structure would work if it passes. But it's going to be close. We don't doubt that at all. We believe that we will pull this through, but it's going to be a dogfight, and it's going to be one of those things that I think is going to come down to the wire. And I do want to point this out too, because you mentioned the court case. In 2018, like you said, Nick, this got thrown off, and kind of the same challenge was done this year. Basically, the same actually challenge was done this year in terms of the approach, challenging the 100-word summary, which had never really been done successfully until the 2018 cycle. And then we saw it happen in all 4 ballot measures that actually submitted signatures this year. And in the lower court that kicked off Invest in Ed, that ruling was so egregious and so outlandish in the scope of that ruling. The summary from the judge, I think he had 100 and something words, or 100 something words, 300 words actually, in his summary of what should have been included in a 100-word summary. So it was impossible. And had that ruling been upheld, it would have killed the initiative process. So I was glad to see the Supreme Court actually unanimously throw that out, because it was just so far over the top. But it underscores the fact that we do have some work, and I think, in terms of how we approach ballot measures in this state and the process. That's another conversation, I know. But I do believe Invest in Ed is going to pass. It's going to be a fight, and it's going to be a smaller margin than I think what will happen in Smart and Safe, which we'll get to in a minute. But the voters are clamoring for education funding. They're looking for a solution. The legislature and quite frankly, the governor haven't really done that for 10 years. They've done some Band-Aids here and there, but nothing permanent. And I think that's what's going to push us over the edge at the end of the day.
So education's been the top issue facing the state of Arizona for the past several years. Voters consistently support education. One of the things the large majority of the electorate believe that teachers remain underpaid and that schools are underfunded. So I definitely think that there is a desire among the electorate to ensure that there's more money in the classroom. I've worked on several school campaigns in a lot of environments, and I can tell you, I think the messaging around strengthening the economy, training our future workforce, that investing in education is critical for our long-term economic growth is a winner. That's a winner message. I saw the commercial too. I don't think the dunking on the legislature and some of the slamming of the state and crapping on Arizona is necessary. I think it's the same pitfall that 204 ran into when they tried to continue the 1 cent sales tax with a permanent extension of that. I don't think you need to spend as much time attacking the state and being negative about it. I think the benefits of the proposal and the need is there more so than the narrative of attacking the state. Also, I think it feels good to do that, but I don't think it's necessary. And then I don't think voters understand the voter protection piece of it. So that sort of felt stuffed in the middle as well. So that's kind of, and I did see the question about money in the classroom. That is a challenge that all school districts and all school funding has, understanding that people tend to believe the money is not making it into the classroom, despite the fact that it is. It also has to do with the way that our audits work and what is considered a in-classroom spending versus not. I mean, we can't run schools without without air conditioning in Arizona, and that's not technically classroom spending, despite the fact that you couldn't have kids in a classroom without it. So part of that is a perception based on where the money is going and that we have some sort of top-heavy administration, which is simply not true. Most districts in the state have less than 10% total spent on administration.
So I think what they both said is incredibly important. This is the #1 issue for most voters in Arizona. And the tension here is that the electorate wants an answer. We saw the 50,000 teachers march. We saw a 20% pay raise from the governor's administration. But as Chad pointed out, it's not enough. Every data point shows that it's not enough, that people believe what Paul said, that we need to invest in our kids. We need to invest in our future in order to have a well-trained workforce that takes us into the 21st century. And that should be available to everybody, not just charter school kids, not just voucher kids, but that opportunity for justice sake should be afforded everyone. So with that, what the answer is from the progressive left is to tax the richest people in Arizona. So let's recognize this for what it is. It is a massively progressive tax scheme to fund a problem that faces the entire state. It's wrong for Arizona. It's wrong. It will hurt our economy. It's not the right answer. And it's complicated. It's complicated because in my book, the real answer is not another sales tax increase, which Kate Brophy-McGee tried to do in the last session and which Democrats would not support. They would not support that. So that again is another signal that this is the most progressive answer to solving a problem. And I think it will be defeated because of that. It's a complicated answer because the state needs to address this problem. And what my pitch has been to most people is to say, this should be the issue, should be the bedrock issue of the 2022 gubernatorial election. And the answer from everybody in the electorate should be to each gubernatorial candidate, how do you plan to solve this problem? If this is defeated, this will be the debate. This will be the debate. And the answer is very complicated. And you can only do it with a governor. It should be a statewide property tax. We do not have a property tax in Arizona. That's the 3 legs of funding government is sales, income, or sales tax, income tax, and property tax. Well, that one leg has been non-existent. So we've been overly reliant on sales taxes, and now we're going to go down this path of sending a message to the economy and investors that we are not suited for your growth in the economy here, because we're going to go after the richest element of society to pay for everybody's education. So you'd want a tax scheme that pays for that affects everybody, that somewhat equally, that invests in everybody equally. And so you can do that. I mean, and you could bring in the business community on that. You could bring in a much broader tax base to do that. And it should be the debate of the 2022 presidential cycle. And if this passes, I wouldn't say that's not going to be an opportunity, but the opportunity will be to continue to talk about that, and maybe with a plan to adopt a statewide property tax while lowering the sales tax and lowering the income tax, because the property tax is a great source of revenue for a long period over time that will grow as the state grows. That's what the answer ought to be. But, you know, to Chad's point, Republicans have not been able to articulate the courage to go make that case. It's something that the business community should have taken up. It should have been invested in, and it's complicated. That's why you need a governor to do this. But I think this will be defeated because it's wrong for our economy.
See Chad anxious to jump in.
So first of all, I'll agree with Chuck, the ending point there, in terms of a couple of things. You know, the business community has had over a decade to tackle this problem, and they haven't done it. And they've been approached by various educational groups out there, various educational organizations to step up and do something, and they haven't done it. They've opposed solutions. They've come up with no ideas on their own. They had their chance, and quite frankly, they blew it. So at some point, the electorate is going to say enough is enough and support something. And you saw, I mean, you know, 440,000 signatures, whatever it was we ended up turning in, that's a lot of signatures. That's a lot of people saying, hey, this is an issue that needs to be put in front of the voters. But then secondly, I would say this too, a property tax, I don't disagree with Chuck in terms of a property tax being a potential solution, but politically it's a non-starter. It's been a non-starter forever. It's going to be a non-starter in the future. We pulled a property tax. When I was in the legislature, I worked on property tax issues. There is zero support for property taxes. And so, quite frankly, too, the argument this is going to make Arizona uncompetitive or, you know, make our economy stale, I would argue the fact that we don't have a property tax is what offsets this. If you want to come to Arizona, you're in that upper top bracket and you want to buy a several $1 million house in Paradise Valley, guess what? It's going to be cheaper to do that in other places. And you're going to pay a slightly larger amount of tax in this new tax bracket that will be created. But this tax bracket is not some astronomical amount as the business community is making it out to be. You know, I just want to point out, if you're a married couple making $501,000 under this new tax system, you're going to be charged the extra surcharge only on that extra $1,000. And that extra $1,000 surcharge will be a $35 addition to your tax bill at the end of the year. This is not some massive tax increase. It actually puts our top tax bracket in the middle of the pack, basically in the country. It makes our tax code fairer. We have a very regressive income tax structure right now in this state. So it balances out, equalizes that out. And, you know, I would argue again with Chuck, property tax, I agree. In theory, it would be great, but I just don't see the political will for that ever happening here in Arizona.
Well, that's what the 2022 cycle is about. We can create the will if the voters want it.
We'll debate.
And you have to sell it. I agree with your analysis. We've never gotten it above 51% either. But that's why you need a governor to do it, because economically it's the right thing to do for Arizona, because our economy as we grow, that's exactly how you get exponential growth in education funding, because as the economy grows, property values, as we're all experiencing, go up. So that's the perfect way to do it, not on a segment of the economy that I may agree with you on your point, but what happens is people will buy a house in Vegas and they'll put their domicile in Vegas. They'll have their vacation home down here, and you just lose the opportunity, and you can escape that tax structure. You need an equitable tax base that goes statewide that everybody has to participate in, and that's what education is. It's a solution that's going to benefit everybody. So I don't disagree with any of the points you said there, Chad, but it's not right for our future state's economy.
Sounds like we could spend 90 minutes on this topic alone.
Let's smoke a little weed here. Chill out.
Right. So now we go over to Smart and Safe Arizona, which is the initiative to legalize recreational marijuana in Arizona. This came up in 2016 on the ballot, lost by only 2.8%. The Smart and Safe group worked with the other yes stakeholders. I know that the language changed a little bit over time, got all the yes stakeholders on in the same boat, and now we have Smart and Safe coming up on the ballot this year. So Chad, obviously you have a vested interest in this. I know the polls are positive in favor of Smart and Safe. What are your expectations?
Yeah, we're feeling, again, 2020 is 2020, so I don't want to be overly optimistic about anything, but we're feeling, cautiously optimistic about this. The polling has been consistent since day one on this. The voter support a pragmatic way to legalize adult use marijuana. We tested this language thoroughly for a long time through a variety of research methods, and this language plays well with the voters. They like the safety standards we put in there. They like the regulatory structure that makes sure that while it's going to be available, you're not going to have a store in every street corner. They like the distribution of money to community colleges, to infrastructure, to public safety, to social justice and public health programs. They really like the concept of how this is structured. We have business protections, so employers are protected. They can manage their workplace as they see fit, which was something that was missing in the language in the last go around. And we did a lot of work, as you point out, Nick, with a lot of stakeholders early on when we started crafting this to make sure we didn't repeat the mistakes of the previous ballot measure here in Arizona, but also learning from some of the other states that have passed this already, learning from the things they did right, as well as learning from some of the things they did wrong. So we really crafted what I think is a very, very responsible approach to this, hence the name Smart and Safe. And we have a wide range of support, from your typical groups you'd expect, but also we have some law enforcement support that's going to be coming out. We have some very diverse supporters. And so to Paul's point, with the way the turnout is trending this election, we feel pretty confident this will pass in November.
Paul, what are your numbers telling you on this issue?
It's going to pass. So all the local electeds that are paying attention, hoping that maybe it won't, it's going to pass. Our polling has showed it consistently in the high 50s, low 60% range. I just finished a poll in Maricopa County on another issue, and it was very high in Maricopa County. We're going to go back out into the field near the end of the month. It's been very consistent all the way through. I think they did a very good job of putting this together, especially one of the things he didn't mention is the protection of kids, the gummy candies and that area was one of the places that I think they were vulnerable previously, and the protections that they put in there on that makes, I think, much more attractive to that swing voter, suburban female that we've talked a lot about so far. I think having confidence and faith that their kids aren't going to end up with weed candy in their Halloween bag, which is the old, wives' tale. I think that's going to be very helpful for them. They've been very consistent, I think, throughout the course of the campaign. With high voter turnout that Chad talked about, no pun intended, I expect that it's likely to pass pretty significantly. I think we will see high numbers, again, no pun intended, for this one.
So I think it's based on everything that I've read about the two races, or at least the presidential race, above all, there's very few independents. So I don't think, am I speaking out of turn when I say I wouldn't expect these initiatives to affect the top of the ticket, but do they have a potential to affect what we're going to talk about next, which is some of the down ballot races in the legislature, particularly Chuck and Chad, what you've been talking about with individuals in the legislature who have been unwilling or unable to take up issues like education and recreational or adult use marijuana.
It is a classic swing voter issue, and to the degree that candidates are aware of that and use it that way and use it as a counter measure, because that's one of the yoga mat questions: is how do you build your electorate rather than diminish your electorate? And for those candidates in competitive races, this may be an opportunity to do some contrasting on that issue to parts of the electorate that are presidential cycle voters, not maybe the highest efficacy voters in some of those swing districts, which we're going to talk about. But whether the campaign manager thinks about that or whether the candidate thinks about that, that may be a different issue, because I think normally we see a lot of campaigns and very few of them are well run. So it may be an issue down the road that people understand, but it's a good comment, Nick, that people could see this as a positive wedge issue, not a negative wedge issue, in terms of identifying your supporters and people who you could rally to the polls to some degree. But the top of the ticket's going to dominate this cycle. I mean, we're in a national debate right now with social justice issues, with climate change, with international tensions, with the economy the way it is. It's very difficult for candidates or campaigns to segment out their messages unless they're really smart in how to do that and how to target that with individual constituencies within their districts.
Okay, I'd like to move on to selfishly some of the things that will affect our work at the league and focus on some of the down ballot races, particularly in the Arizona House and Senate. So first, we're going to start in numerical order with Legislative District 4. Again, this is a district that has been run by Democrats for the last several cycles. I think, in fact, even Republicans haven't even run a counter candidate in many of these races. This time around, Joel John is running as a single shot candidate in LD4. In the yellow sheet last week, there was a report that Republicans were feeling optimistic about their opportunities in Legislative District 4 for a pickup. Mr. John was the second leading vote getter in this district in the primary. So, Paul, have you seen any early polling in this area? And if not, how do we think this race shapes up? Is there enough of an opportunity there in the single shot strategy for the Republicans to have a pickup in a cycle where I think it was largely expected that they'd be defending all seats?
It's funny that we start with 4 because 4 is probably the only real Republican pickup opportunity that we're going to talk about today. So it's sort of, but it's interesting in that, as you mentioned, Joel John got about 1,500 more votes than Peyton did in the second place slot. She had a fall off about 4,000 votes compared to Fernandez, which should be concerning for Democrats. When you've got 2 people on the ballot, you want them to be relatively close to one another. Mr. John is from a longtime farming family in Buckeye. He's also a school teacher and is bilingual. So he's got some things that going for him that I think make him an attractive single shot candidate. This is a heavily Democratic district. There's no doubt. I think the participation advantage is something like 14 points for Democrats. So it's a steep hill to climb, but I think John is an ideal candidate for that type of race and probably one of the only GOP pickups we're looking at right now.
Chad, are Democrats inviting Republicans to spend money in this district so that they're not spending money elsewhere because they feel confident about their chances, or are they legitimately concerned?
I think there's a level of concern, and I think Paul's correct in the fact that this is probably the only district that the Republicans have a shot at picking up a seat in. The primary turnout was, slightly concerning for Democrats, but I do think going back to Paul's earlier presentation, that gap is going to close pretty quickly in the general. I think once you have the enthusiastic Democrats coming out for the general election, they're being driven by Trump. They're going to vote for both of these candidates. And ultimately, I think that the Dems pull this out. It'll be closer than it should be, probably, given the makeup of the district. But I think at the end of the day that the Dems will hold on to this seat.
The minority leader's paying attention to this. I know she's paying attention to her seatmate. We've gotten calls. So she's paying attention, which is important. And Jure, I think, is going to work harder than she did in the primary. But as Paul pointed out, Joel John's a really good candidate. And the Republicans are going to make an effort here. So I think we all agree that it's a heavily Democratic district and it's an uphill fight, but it's a possible one.
Something to keep an eye on over the next couple months. Okay, the next competitive district is Legislative District 6. As you can see, we have both the Senate and the House on here. I think since I've been around the legislature, I've heard quiet chirps get a little bit louder from the left, thinking that they'll have an opportunity to pick up seats in this area. Wendy Rogers beat out a longtime legislator, Sylvia Allen, in this district. And so Felicia French is a candidate. She's a veteran. She's a nurse. She ran in the House, in this district in the House last time, so she has name recognition. I think it's unfair to compare, obviously, primary numbers simply because Wendy Rogers was in a competitive race. But then we look at the House seats, and this was a scenario where the Democrats in 2018 did not run a single shot, and that that likely hurt them in this district in in a situation where they only lost by 577 votes. So I think they had the strategy to run a single shot this time. Art Babbitt, former county supervisor, decided to run as an independent. So for both of these races, both the Senate and the House, how do you see these shaking out, and how does the impact of now Art Babbitt being a participant in the race, how does that impact maybe the opportunity for Mayor Evans to get in there, or for Brenda Barton, who was the third vote getter in the primary here?
Paul, you want to start off?
Sure. I think LD6 is probably the ultimate swing district in this upcoming election. I think there's going to be a lot of eyes on this district. And I think a lot of folks who don't live in the area assume that LD6 is mostly the White Mountains. And that is not, in fact, the case. LD6 actually has a significant portion of Coconino County. It also has a significant portion of Yavapai County, and then a sliver of Navajo as well. But it's a big district. And Art Babbitt, Coconino is the largest portion of this. And Art Babbitt was a Coconino County supervisor for a long time and has a great name. You know, I laugh at every article about him because they always say no relation to Governor Bruce Babbitt, but they talk about it a lot. I don't sleep on Art Babbitt. I think he really has a shot in this race, particularly when you look at Blackman got about 26,000 votes. Barton got about 17,000. So there's a 10,000 vote drop off between the two. And then you also, Evans got 24,000. So she's got a pretty solid Democrat support, but there's a big gap in the middle there that I think Babbitt could take advantage of. In the Senate side, you look at Sylvia Allen defeated her Democrat challenger 2 years ago by a little over 1,700 votes. And in this primary alone, Felicia French got more than 6,000 additional votes than the Democrat Senate candidate 2 years ago. That's a massive uptick in participation in that district. And Wendy Rogers is no Sylvia Allen. So I think that that's going to be a really, really competitive race there. Wendy Rogers has fully embraced Trump. Trump's all over her signs. This will be, I think this race more than maybe any other race besides the actual presidential election will be a referendum on Trump.
Interesting.
And I would add, you know, Paul mentioned something I was going to highlight. I think people often forget that really the center of the population for this district is Flagstaff. That's really where the bulk of the voters are. You know, and I've been saying for the past couple cycles that on the Democratic side, the Dems should have had a candidate from Flagstaff, not from outlying areas, not some of the smaller rural towns like they had last cycle. So I think the Dems got it right this time when they got Mayor Evans to run for the House seat. She's a very strong candidate. She has good name ID in Flagstaff. She's raising a ton of money. And so, you know, the X factor is Art Babbitt. Does he have an impact on the outcome of this? I don't know. You know, to Paul's point, he has a good name, even though it's not spelled the same as the actual Babbitt name, but it resonates with voters, and he has a history of being an elected up in that area. So what he does that race is hard to tell, but I do think Coral is a great candidate. I think she's going to get into one of those seats this time around. And on the Senate side, I think, to Paul's point, had Sylvia held on, I think it would have been, I probably would have given the edge to Sylvia in that race. But now that Wendy Rogers won that primary, Felicia French is another strong candidate, another one raising a lot of money. And I think if that Flagstaff vote comes out, if that Coconino County vote comes out, you're going to see this district flip control in both the Senate, well, at least one seat in the House, and the Senate flip as well.
I mean, this is where the Democratic Party is put a lot of chips. They've done a great job. Rodolini and the team has done a great job of raising a lot of money, and they're focused on this race. I would expect Walt Blackman to survive. He's been a great member. He's solid. He's got good support. I mean, that's the Art question. Art is has been a great county supervisor. He's an independent, great thinker, wonderful man. But I'd expect Walt to survive. All of the other races are what's in question, and everybody's going to be watching this, as these two gentlemen just pointed out, for potential flips. So I would agree with all the things they said.
Okay, let's move on to Legislative District 17. I think this just goes to Paul's map about Maricopa County. and the changes in the East Valley, Southeast Valley. I don't know if I think the closeness, at least from my analysis or from my thoughts prior to in 2018, was that this was much closer than I had expected it to be. J.D. Mesnard beat out Steve Weichert by 1,700 votes, 1,744 votes. This time around, again, this is 2 years further into the top of the ticket, which is driving turnout, obviously. 2 years further into in-migration into a district that's tech focused. And I also know that Corduli also picked up substantial number of votes in the primary as compared to Weichert the last time. I think it's a couple thousand votes difference. So how does this, Paul, what are you seeing here in 17 and how does this district play out?
I think it's important to note, as Chuck mentioned earlier, that Democrats picked up 4 seats in the House 2 years ago. This is one of them. They picked up this traditionally Republican district, which still has a Republican participation advantage. Jennifer Palak, which was a great candidate, school teacher, exactly what they were looking for, did a single shot effort. I think they were very wise to also keep it a single shot on the House side of this race this time around. I think that's effective. I'm not sure LD 17 is ready to shift just yet. It is the place that it is one of the places that we've been watching for a long time that eventually likely will. LD 18, which is next door, that Ahwatukee area, is one that shifted over time, and Democrat registration, it's actually now a blue district. It was a long time purple swing district. I believe it's LD 18 is now basically a Democrat district. It's represented by 3 Democrats, and I don't see that changing. And Robson's got a good shot of the people of the Republicans, but with 2 in that race, I think that one's a little tough. But LD 17, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's going to be a lot closer than people predict because it's a high voter turnout. But just like Babbitt has a great name for LD 6, I'm not sure if Kurtoglu is the name that's going to motivate people to change their mind this time around. I don't know how to pronounce it either, so I apologize if that's incorrect.
And you know, the question, and AJ is actually a really good candidate. He's an immigrant, small business owner. He really kind of embodies the American dream. You know, to Paul's point, the question is, can he get that narrative to those swing voters? This district is all about those suburban swing voters that we've talked about throughout this discussion today. Can he break through and get those suburban, college-educated, independent women and center-right Republican women to shift? He's going to have to tell a story, and that's sometimes tough when you're running a legislative race, as we all know, because there's so much noise out there, and especially when it's not the ideal environment to go knocking door to door and talking to people one-on-one in this pandemic situation. So he has some ground to make up, and he has to get creative about how to get in touch with those voters and tell his story. But he does have a really good story. He comes from the private sector, which I think is appealing to voters out there. And those primary numbers, I mean, I was shocked when I saw how many votes he got in the primary. And so it put it on my radar. And I would say if this seat were to flip, you can virtually guarantee that the Democrats will take control of the Senate at that point if this seat flips. This would be the bellwether, the canary in the coal mine. If you see this on election night flipping to Dems, the Senate's going to go Democratic this cycle.
So this is back into the map that Paul showed earlier. This is in the heart of that purple area. So this is what's happening in Maricopa County. So this is an area where that could be expected, with the national narrative and turnout taking care of itself in this cycle. You're going to have, as Paul pointed out earlier, you're going to have about 500,000 more voters than in the 18-16 cycle here. And so you get a bigger turnout amongst those non-affiliated voters and non-traditional general election voters. So if you know that, and then as you pointed out earlier, Nick, this is also in one of those areas where those high-income people reside, and education is going to be the #1 issue. I would expect in this cycle that the Invest in Ed issue will win in this district. And so and I know, as we all concluded earlier, the marijuana issue will win in this district. So the contrast with Mr. Mesnard, who's an economic conservative, who was a former Speaker of the House, is a potential for a narrative. Also with AJ's business background that Chad talked about, you could see a narrative developing in this race underneath all the other noise that's going to happen in the election cycle. That you could see a narrative that would promote and a locality to that narrative that would promote the opportunity for a shift. JD's had a long record out there. He's been elected multiple times and has. I could see it. I don't expect it, though. I don't expect this race to flip, but I could see it. It doesn't happen till it happens. But Republicans are deeply aware of the vulnerability of this seat as well. And I would expect a really aggressive campaign from Mr. Mesnard, which is going to maybe won't hear all those great things about BJ. So we shall see.
And to your point, Chuck, I think this was actually the district that I was thinking the most about when I asked about the Invest in Ed and the impact on the down ballot stuff because of how Mesnard was targeted in 2018 on the ballot. So yeah. Okay, moving along to Legislative District 20. This is one, again, that we heard about in 2018 that had the potential for change. I think in 2018, the Senate seat had 3 candidates. The third candidate was more on the right, but there were some split votes there. Paul Boyer ended up winning by 2,800 votes. Also in this House race, the Democrats, again this cycle, smartly I think you would suggest, elected to run a single shot here as opposed to what they did in 2018, where there were 2 separate candidates. Judy Schweibert was the top vote getter in the primary, outpolling both Kern and Bollock. And so I think, what are you guys seeing here? And I'll go ahead and kick it over to Chuck and see what your thoughts are.
Back to what I just finished with. This is in that area. This is in that purple area, that expanding purple area. As you just said, Schweibert is a single shot on the Democratic side. Shauna and Mr. Kern represent more conservative, cultural conservative side of the caucus. Again, an area where there's good contrast on a local level, particularly with some of the district that's changing. Similarly, Mr. Boyer's been busy. He's got a small child at home. He's getting his master's degree. Again, it's an opportunity for Mr. Irvin. But again, it doesn't happen. This traditionally it's a +7 GOP advantage on turnout. So they're going to have to win Republican voters. They're going to have to win independent voters in order to flip that, even in this cycle. We're going into redistricting too, and we'll see how this district changes after redistricting. And so we're going to see some shift. Mr. Kern was, chairman of the Rules Committee, a hardcore conservative. There is an opportunity for them to contrast here with those cultural conservatives in what has historically been a safe Republican district. I mean, this has been a layup for most Republicans for a long time. But as we've observed here, it's the district's changing due to cultural and economic trends.
And this is the kind of the west part of Phoenix. It's kind of a suburban working class district. And I think, Chuck talked about the last district in terms of the education issue. I think the education issue is going to come into play in this district. I think it's a big, big issue for many of these voters. And for those of you that have been around for a while and been involved in state capitol or state politics for a while, my prediction for this is going to be the 2020 version of Jackie Thrasher. Jackie won this district in, I think, the 2006 election in what was kind of the old District 20, pre-redistricting in 2010. She snuck in there, kind of got one of the Republicans out of the way, and I think that's going to happen in the House. I think the Senate's a long shot here, but I do think that Schweibert has some very good opportunities here. There's a lot of issues for both Mr. Kern and for Ms. Bollock. They both have some issues, Mr. Kern in particular. And I think with the education layered on top of that, education funding issue layered on top of that, there's an opportunity for Dems to pick up a seat in the House here.
This is one of the places that we talked about with the increased voter turnout District 20 for a long time, we pointed to that it was a swing state in the making, and it just hadn't happened before now. Republicans typically dominated in this district and had for a long time, and then suddenly Schwiebert just got 2,500 more votes than any Republican in the primary election alone, and so suddenly it reached that potential that we've seen for it for a while, and so it's going to be a lot more competitive. People are paying more attention than ever before in that district, and it's part of that place that's changing. And if you look at this compared to the one we just talked about, I think 20 is more likely to have some sort of shift than 17 is.
So, but we should point out that Senator Boyer has not been a reliable Republican vote on all things. He has crafted his narrative of his election is much more similar to what the district would say that it has been over time. It's changing, and he is not a hardcore right, smaller government. He was back in the firefighters' cancer prevention bill. He was back in a number of stuff that was not popular in his caucus, and so he is one of those people who I think sees the future of the district, and he's been trying to navigate towards it.
I think the firefighters, to your point, will be key in this race.
Also makes that, assuming he retains his spot, as Chad said, it would be a unlikely change. But assuming he retains his spot, he could hold a whole lot of power, depending on what the outcome is of the election, because of his willingness to work on both sides.
Yep.
Moving on to Legislative District 21, and I want to go over this one relatively quickly because I want to get to Legislative District 28, which is the last one that we're going to cover. Kathy Connect ran against Rick Gray in the Senate last time as an independent. This time around, she has moved over to the House, another single shot. This is Peoria, Surprise area. Is this one a long shot? She was the leading vote getter, but the Republicans also had a competitive primary. So there was some siphoning off of votes there. Is this a legitimate opportunity, Paul?
This is a heavily Republican district. This goes well into North Peoria. It's a 15-point Republican participation advantage. It's got Vistancia and some other areas in it. Connected very, very well in the El Mirage portions and the Old Town Surprise portions of the district. Last time around, I expect she'll do well in those areas, which we'll see higher than usual turnout in. But ultimately, it'll be how well does she translate to some of those Peoria areas, especially the places that are growing rapidly and have education concerns. I think her time on the school board will help with that. The other thing, this is technically an open seat. Pingarelli is not an incumbent, so it is probably more competitive than it has been in the past. I think she's got a shot at it. This is the one that I think is the bellwether. If the Democrats can pick up this one, this would be an indicator of where the House is going to go. But it's going to be a much tighter race. Connect is a very good candidate. It is a very heavily Republican district.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I would just say, to Paul's point, if this seat flips, the Dems will almost certainly have control of the House as well. And I would add that this is a tough district, but if there is a perfect candidate for this district at this moment in time, in the environment we're in for the Democrats, it's Kathy Connect. Due to her education background, I think she'll appeal to those moderates. And I think if that turnout closes down to that 3% gap that Paul's predicting, she has a really good shot at actually pulling a pretty big upset on election night.
Yeah.
All right. Legislative District 28. This is full disclosure. Not only is this my home district, but Kate Brophy-McGee has been a league champion basically since her time coming into the legislature. I have nothing but positive things to say about Senator Brophy-McGee. That said, in 2018, this was the tightest race of all the legislative races. She won by 267 votes, Senator Brophy-McGee did. She faced off against Christine Marsh at that time. Christine Marsh has that similar background, education background to some of the other folks that we've talked about today. The district, I think, has continued to change over time. So where is Senator Brophy McGee? And Chad, I know that she was one of the ones that you would work across the aisle with when you were in the legislature. She was in the House at the time. You both voted on Medicaid expansion, but where do we see Senator Brophy McGee going in this district? She did trail substantially in the primary vote count, but I don't ever want to count her out because she's such a strong candidate.
Yeah, and you know, to your point, Nick, you know, I worked very, very closely and had a great relationship with Senator Brophy McGee during my time in the legislature, and have the utmost respect for her. I think she's a great elected official, great community person. I really liked working with her, and I think she, you know, has been a very, very effective elected official. In full disclosure, this is now my home district too. I recently bought a house and moved out of my old district about half a mile, so now I'm an LD 28. So now I'm a voter in this district as well. You know, I think though, with the trends heading the way they are, and the gap we've seen continually close with each election cycle in this district, that I think Christine Marsh is going to win this one this time. I think the numbers are just headed her way. The enthusiasm gap on the Democratic side, the trend for independents to request Democratic ballots, I think it all adds up to a victory for Christine Marsh this time. It's going to be close, don't get me wrong, but you know, the House seats have been under Democratic control now. Both House seats are Dems. Paul kind of mentioned this earlier. I see LD 28 being the next LD 18. LD 18 shifted from, you know, full Republican control to now full Dem control over the past few cycles. I think that 2020 will be the year we see LD 28 make that shift as well and go full Dem. And so we'll see, but they're both running very good campaigns, a lot of money in the district. It's going to be close, but if I had to make a bet on it, I would say that Christine Marsh is going to pull this one out.
Chuck? So my district too. Chad's right about all the demographic changes. There's the Democrats did an amazing, effective voter registration drive in the district, and it's difficult for, given the demographics of the cycle and the higher voter turnout, to see how Kate can navigate this. But back to our education discussion, you know, I love Kate in my district too, and she's got to take the gloves off, and she's got to go after her on the progressive nature of Red for Ed and promise a better solution. That would be effective in this district. A very effective message and attack on Red for Ed and tying her to that progressive agenda, which is not 28. That's not 28. And working hard to define that. And Kate has been known, as I said earlier in this presentation, to talk about alternatives and alternative solutions. But that's you know, again, it's going to come down to the campaign, and you gotta take the gloves off here. And she's, you know, I've known Kate, I loved her for a long time, but it's hard for candidates who are like that, who are that nature, to do that. And you know, I don't expect that, but if there's a chance here, if she, you know, every election has a narrative that leads to the next election. And if she wants to win, she's going to have to lead on that narrative, which is in the 22 cycle.
Real quick, Paul, because I want to get Chad's one last comment from Chad, but I know he has a hard out at 11. So do you have a thought on this one?
I'm glad to bring some West Valley perspective here, since I'm the only one not in LD 28. So that's good to know. I think Chad hit the nail on the head. The demographics of this district are changing. Kate Brophy McGee is the best possible Republican for this district. She will also likely be, in its current configuration, the last Republican to represent that district. Whether or not she's successful in this election, there's nobody else like her. I don't think any other Republican can win this district but her. She's got the best possible shot.
Okay, Chad, just quickly before you have to jump off, what's your prognosis? In 2018, the Senate was 17 Republican, 13 Democrat. The House, 31 Republican, 29 Democrat. Where do you put the numbers at on November 4th?
Yeah, so I will say this with the caveat that, again, to Chuck's earlier point, it's 2020. We still got, you know, 2 months. Anything can happen based on a tweet from the president or another natural disaster taking place. But, you know, if I were saying today what's going to look like, I'm going to say the state Senate's going to be tied. I think it's going to be a 15-15 split in the Senate. And I think the House is going to actually flip control. I think you're going to have a 31-29 Democratic majority in the House. You know, I will point this out. I've been saying for years, since I was the minority leader, after the redistricting that the House would be the first one to flip. Some people thought I was crazy. Last cycle, I said the Dems would take 5 seats. They took 4. Some people thought I was crazy then. I do think that they're going to flip it this time. So it'll be 31-29, flip the control in the House, and 15-15 in the Senate.
Chuck, what are your thoughts?
Well, historical perspective, the last time the Senate was in Democratic hands, I was working for Grant Woods in 1990, and Pete Rios was the president of the Senate. So that hadn't happened in a long time. The House is even further back from that, to Chad's point. I want to be as serene as that pond in the background here and just say that I don't think Chad's far off from his prediction of what it could be, with the caveat that the election cycle has nothing to do with that pond. It is completely different than that. And there's opportunities for great change. Campaigns make a difference in close races. And any of these things that we talked about today could flip based upon an aggressive and effective campaign by any member of all of the people we talked about today. I ran Fife Symington's campaign in 1994 with a whole team of incredibly talented people, including my colleague Doug Cole. We were down 28 points the week after the Labor Day. And we never told Fife that, of course, but we won going away. And so campaigns make a difference. And I would say everybody should, what we're doing is watching these races. What you should do is watch the campaigns.
Hey, Nick, I got to jump off. I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thanks, Paul, Chuck, always fun. And good luck to everybody in the cycle. And I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Chad. Go ahead. Yeah. Paul, what are your thoughts on the final numbers?
Now that Chad's gone, we can talk about it. No, just kidding. I think that there is a world in which both are split. We look at a 15-15 Senate and a 30-30 House. That's very 2020 of us, wouldn't it be, to have it all go out that way? That's about the craziest combination. But the good news there would be that they'd need a really good pollster to help them understand what they ought to be talking about. So my guess is that I think we're looking at, between the two, I think it's a very steep hill for the Senate to flip. I think there's a much more clear pathway for the House. But at the end of the day, because it's 2020 and murder hornets and whatever else, and who knows what's going to happen the next 60 days, right now I'm predicting both of them be split.
Oh, 30-30 and 15-15.
Yeah.
Interesting. Nice cop out on that one. One question real quick, and I know you guys got to jump off, but there was a good question. What about the likelihood of the Trump-Kelly voters? In 2018, there were a lot of Ducey Cinema voters. And in fact, Maricopa County turned that election a few days after the election night. So what are there for likelihoods of Trump-Kelly voters?
Well, as Paul has pointed out, and our numbers indicate, that was about 195,000 voters in the last cycle. With the increased turnout, that's somewhere between 250 and 350,000 voters in this cycle. And they are the swing audience. That's who both presidential campaigns and any statewide campaign has to pay attention to, and narrate a campaign to, and have stories that compel those voters to come your way, not just beat up your opponent. And so that remains to be a significant constituency in a statewide election.
The Trump-Kelly voter is real. They do exist. I don't think, I don't claim to know exactly why they're doing that, but what it really speaks to is the fall off a little bit, that there is a gap, enthusiasm gap between Trump and Mcsally, is what that speaks to. Is that the Mcsally, you saw Dana McCarthy get about 20% of the overall electorate in the primary, which is, those folks may either not vote, or there's some of them that will vote for Kelly. So he has a celebrity nature around him. I think we talked about that. My wife, who's an independent, said, Mark Kelly, the astronaut, he's a national hero. I mean, there's a lot of people who believe that. So I think that's part of it, as well as people who maybe not pay close attention, but like the personality or like the celebrity status, those are likely to be Trump-Kelly folks.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys. I know we went just a tiny bit over that 90 minutes. We really appreciate your participation and your help. This was, I think, very insightful for me and for hopefully everybody that was online. And we'll see what happens over the next 60 days. I think over the last 4 years, we've learned that, 6 days, what happens in 6 days might be whatever in 60 days in the past. So we appreciate you guys jumping on, and we'll keep an eye on it. Thank you guys.
Thanks, Nick.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.